Well, hi again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of 100 Yards of Football. This is our Legend Show, and as you can see, Vincent Turner is not with us today. He'll return next week and be with us throughout the week, but was unable to make it this morning. Thank you, Jeremiah Long, for putting the show together. And Brian LeBel joins me here today. Brian, welcome to the show. But before we start, I just want to say thank you to all the folks that have already tuned into previous episodes and have looked at mybookie.ag as a place to place your bets. It's a simple, easy process. You just go online. You can get all your questions answered, but if you are interested, you can log in, enter a username and a password, create an account, fund the account, and then place bets on any of the games that are coming up. For example, March Madness. If you like Auburn or if you like Florida or any of the other two teams that are a part of the March Madness finale with the Final Four, you can place a bet on that. The Major League Baseball season has just begun. You've got NHL and NBA playoffs right around the corner. If you want to place a conditional bet on horses or a more traditional bet on casino-type action, it's all available for you at mybookie.ag. So go there, use the promotional code MM50, MM50, and we greatly appreciate it. So thank you for being a part of mybookie.com. And Brian, thank you for being a part of the show here today. We are going to take a look at and honor Franco Harris here in our Legends Show, the amazing Pittsburgh Steeler. He did play one season in Seattle, but even diehard Steeler fans will say, come on, man, that was just an illusion. He was a Steeler from the Penn State area in college. He grew up in New Jersey, but he is definitely one of the great difference makers in Pittsburgh Steeler history.
Yeah, I think he is sort of synonymous with winning because if you think about it, he was there. The Immaculate Reception, obviously, is what you think about first and foremost when Franco Harris's name comes up. But that was Pittsburgh's first ever playoff win. I mean, that was a big deal for them. That was sort of, getting the monkey off their back and say, hey, we're a part of this now. And it started something. Obviously, it snowballed, but Franco being a big part of that and being the face of that is pretty cool. And it's I think the older guard of Steelers fans will agree he's kind of the guy when it comes to Pittsburgh football, at least, the early part, right? We're talking about the 70s and the 80s.
Well, when you go back to Pittsburgh and great moments in their history, one of them would be in 1969 when they bring in Chuck Noll. They had only won 2 games in 68. They only won 1 in 69, but things started to change. You got L.C. Greenwood. Mean Joe Green was a part of the draft class then. Then you bring in Bradshaw. There's some other great names that are a part of the Steeler history. Dwight White was in 71, Jack Ham, Mike Wagner, Roy Girella. And I'll mention Roy just because who talks about a kicker? Well, Roy had his own little cheering squad. Franco's Italian Army, Girella's Gorillas, Lambert's Lunatics. They were all different facets of when the Steelers there became synonymous with winning, as you mentioned a moment ago. But the way that they changed things, Terry Hanratty was there, Joe Gilliam was there. They all played, but it took a young Terry Bradshaw to kind of settle everything down and put the quarterback position out of controversy. It was his job to lose. But Mel Blount, Frenchie Fuqua, Rocky Bleier, all of those names were synonymous with some of the great Steeler names, but they didn't go to the playoffs until Franco's rookie year, and that was in 1972. So if you look at the picture right in the middle there, that is the 72 Immaculate Reception. That's the final photo. It looks like Franco's at about the 11 or 12-yard line. He's stiff-arming one of the Raiders, and we'll talk a little bit about the controversy of that and also just the great rivalry that came about in NFL playoff history between the Steelers and the Raiders there in the 70s. It was absolutely amazing. But let's go back to the beginning. Franco Doak Harris, born on March 7th, 1950 in Fort Dix, New Jersey. His father, Cad Harris, was a World War II veteran. And part of when he served in that conflict was when he was in Italy. And he met a young girl named Gina. They fell in love. She became what's called a war bride. They get married in Italy and they come back to the States and they live in New Jersey. They have a small family, but Franco being one of those. He was born in the New Jersey area in Fort Dix, but they end up going a little bit further away from there. The Mount Holly Township is where Franco ends up going to high school. Rancocas Valley Regional. And that's where Franco kind of started living his life, if you will, and his athletic life began. Played football, a little basketball, was a baseball player. But Brian, he lived right next door to the high school. So while most guys, they take a shower, they got to get in the car, or they got to walk home, Franco is eating dinner before most of them have left the parking lot. Right next door. He got to work out a little bit longer. He still got to eat at the right time. But one of the traits that everyone said is this guy, I mean, he was just right down the street. So football obviously became a big part of his life. And there's one specific play. I want to go back real quick if I can. I'm going to put my glasses on. So I wrote this down. This was kind of funny. They were state champions in 1966. And there was one play that one of the teammates remembered. I'll be real quick with this. Morristown was a rival. They had just scored a touchdown. Late in the game, they've got the lead. They didn't want to kick it deep. So what their philosophy was when they break the huddle and they put their kickoff team out on the field is the kicker was just going to kick a little dribbler. It was going to roll around where nobody was. Somebody's going to pick it up about the 30, 25, 20-yard line. They're going to tackle them. They're going to win the game. The kicker approaches the ball, and when he makes contact with it, he hits a line drive that goes right to Franco, who's in the front five. He's right in the middle. And he's, because of his size, he was 6'2". He weighed about 220 pounds back then, big guy, but he was going to be one of the blockers. The ball goes straight to Franco. And while the other four guys in the front line are dropping back and looking to return, when they turn around to set their block, they see the official at the other end of the end zone with his hands up in the air. Franco had taken the ball. He eluded the kicker. And next thing you know, he runs about 55 yards for a touchdown. And nobody else on the field, at least not for the Reconcas Valley what are they? The Red Hawks. They score. So they help win, undefeated season. But Franco gets noticed, and he narrows it down to Michigan, Colgate, and Penn State. And the interesting thing about that to me is Franco's upbringing, military background, lots of discipline. He was going to go into the Army, much like his father. But they never talked about college. And he played football so well that he was recruited by Bo Schembechler, as I mentioned, and a young man named Joe Paterno, who'd only been at Penn State for a couple of years, ends up wooing him away and bringing him. He becomes a Nittany Lion, and what a difference that made in his life.
Yeah, I mean that was the start of, obviously spring vaulted him to the NFL and what ended up being a tremendous career. But yeah, I mean his numbers at Penn State, because remember he shared time at Penn State. He wasn't the guy. He blocked for, they had an All-American running back there in LeBel Mitchell.
Yeah.
So he was still able to put up pretty decent stats though, for not being the guy, technically being a fullback, depending on how you want to look at what he's characterized at. But he was too good with the football to basically just say, hey, we're going to have you just block and fill a gap for us, as opposed to, hanging on the ball, because he had a really impressive career in college. I mean, he was averaging 5.5 yards a touch for most of his collegiate career. He had one down year, I want to say his junior year, but I mean, his numbers were really, really good based on his attempts, based on what he's able to do, and based on who he's playing for, the offense, who he's sharing the ball with. Franco had a very, very good career at Penn State for the Nittany Lions.
Yeah, let's take a look at that. When he and LeBel Mitchell, both who brought in at the same year when they were freshmen, Penn State was 11-0. They beat Kansas in the Orange Bowl. Players couldn't play as freshmen back in that era. So 69, his sophomore year, is when he gets his first opportunity to go on the field. And LeBel had been quoted as saying, guess what? This guy, Franco Harris, I'm pretty good too. The two of us, we kind of know that we were the it factor in terms of Penn State. There wasn't anybody else on the roster, even though there were some juniors and seniors ahead of them that didn't have the same type of talent that LeBel, obviously, who had a great NFL career playing with the Colts. And he was a difference maker for them. But Franco, as a fullback exclusively, who had a halfback's mind, he could break it to the left or right and cut loose. He could avoid the traffic. He was a lot faster than he looked. Big, long, kind of different and very unique running back style. He ran upright more than most. You can see he's not leaning forward in many of these pictures. That's not a disrespectful thing. It's just his style. It was different. He was bigger than most people. And because of that, you look at him in the immaculate reception right there, he's just stiff-arming a smaller player. So he takes advantage of that. That second year, his sophomore year, which is the first year that he's eligible. You mentioned 643 yards. He had 10 touchdowns that year. So those are numbers that a halfback would have, or a tailback. They were 11-0. They win the Orange Bowl. Junior year, they go 7-3. He rushes for another 8 touchdowns and 675 yards there. And then his senior year, they were 11-1. They defeat Texas. They win the Cotton Bowl there. He had another 7 touchdowns, but he gets to play in the Senior Bowl. And that, Franco said, that was a difference maker for him. He had a great time while he was there, but he gets to be seen by a lot of different coaches. And now they're talking about drafting him. And where the NFL wasn't really a mindset for him early on, he ends up being the 14th pick for the Pittsburgh Steelers, their number 1 draft pick there in the 72 draft.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, to be because I mean, he still did fullback duties, right? He was still a guy who was like, "Hey, we need you to block," and he was very, very good at that as well. But he was a better running back, and I think Pittsburgh saw that. They said, "Hey, listen, based on your build, based on how you run, I mean, it's unique. When you're 6'2", you don't have a lot of 6'2" running backs. If you watch a guy like Derrick Henry's kind of the cream of the crop as far as bigger backs in the NFL today. It's not necessarily, the leaning forward. It's using your size to your advantage. I think Franco Harris epitomizes that. He knew he was bigger than a lot of these guys. That's why in almost every one of these pictures, you look at him, he's stiff arming a guy, he's moving around a guy because he's like, hey, I'm bigger than you. I can bully you. I'm fast enough to where I can run fast past you. And it's my unique style, and it worked very, very well for him, both in college and in the professional level.
Yeah, Bill Dunn was the personnel director, general manager there with the Steelers, and Chuck Noll. They both were thinking, we like this kid, Robert Newhouse. We would rather have him. Well, Robert ends up going to the Dallas Cowboys. They bring in a future Cowboy, Preston Pearson, but they had Frenchie Fuqua as well. They draft Franco 13th overall. I said 14th, so forgive me, folks, for that. But basically, things started changing, the way that they run the ball. And now Steeler fans are starting to feel a little bit different. And they give him a nickname. They say Franco's Italian Army is the group of folks that root for this guy. Every time he touches the ball, that group gets up on their feet and they start yelling. When they kick a field goal, Gorillas, they end up being the ones that cheer a little bit louder. They go to the playoffs in 72. They're hosting this game. It's the first home game, as you mentioned, in decades, 25 years since their previous playoff appearance. So Steeler fans were dying for something different. And they had the newer stadium. It had been built in the early 70s. 69, I think, is when it was completed. But they're playing, and it's dirty. It's dark. It's 2 days before Christmas. Guys on AstroTurf aren't supposed to have dirty jerseys, but you look around, even some of the Raiders in the white jerseys. The throw is made. The Immaculate Reception is done. And Franco's legacy begins. They win their first playoff game. They lose the AFC Championship the next week to Miami. Miami is the undefeated Super Bowl champions that year in 72. But real quick, I wanted to mention one thing about the Immaculate Reception. Phil Villapiano has been quoted on numerous times saying, wait a second, when Franco makes the catch, I'm right there next to him. Next thing I know, I'm face down. Someone hits me from behind. That's illegal. The ball touched the ground. That's illegal. The ball hit Frenchie Fuqua, bounces off him, and he touches it. Then it goes off Jack Tatum and bounces back. At that time, it was an illegal touch. That was illegal. The Raiders had 5 different situations that were saying, there's no way. Immaculate deception. Well, the officials met after Franco had scored, and it was probably 3 or 4 minutes. Meanwhile, the fans are streaming on the field. They knew that if they changed the call and it became Raiders ball, because it was 4th down and 10 with 22 seconds left, there would be a riot. They wouldn't make it out of there. And some of the Franco army might have been armed, if you know what I'm saying. So the call goes the Steelers' way, and that begins this great rivalry between the Steelers and the Raiders. The following year in 73, another couple of big draft picks. Steelers go to the playoffs again. And this time they lose to the Raiders. The Raiders would end up losing to Miami. The Dolphins go to another Super Bowl. But I'm telling you what, the rivalry between those two teams was absolutely outstanding all throughout the 70s. They couldn't stand each other. They take turns beating one another in big and significant games. And I think that made the NFL, much like what Larry Bird and Magic Johnson did to help the NBA in the 80s, the Steelers and the Raiders helped changed the AFL especially, but the NFL in whole, and it became must-watch TV.
It really epitomizes rivalries in North American sports, because before that there wasn't really a lot of hate. There wasn't really a lot of, just pure disdain for another opponent, whether as a fan or as a player. But I think what happened between the Raiders and the Steelers in the 70s, the back and forth, a lot of meaningful football games, I think it really created the dynamic, what you have for a lot of teams now. I mean, if you look at the Steelers, you still have that rivalry with the Raiders. Raiders obviously haven't been good in a while, so it doesn't really stem as much there. But with the Ravens, they got a rivalry going with the Ravens now, because the Ravens are good, we're good, we don't like you, but you have that all over the league now. You have we try to do stuff on Thanksgiving. The Cowboys will play Washington or whoever it is, and there's rivalries that budded post Steelers Raiders. But that was sort of the first one where it was kind of national news. It was sort of a conversation, not just between Steelers fans and Raiders fans, but everybody. Hey, they're playing again in the playoffs. They don't like each other. It's back and forth. Who wins? You remember what happened last year? Remember what happened the year before? Whatever. But it really has kind of made it more interesting as a fan, and there's probably a little bit more oomph in the players, like, hey, we really need to beat these guys. We don't want to see these guys win, and certainly don't want them to beat us.
Well, the analogy of my two favorite teams are whatever my team is, and then whoever's playing the Steelers. You know what I mean? That kind of kicked in as well. Because if you were in Kansas City at that time, if you were in Baltimore at that time, if you were in Denver or Miami, there's four other teams throughout the AFC aspect of it. Houston was kind of a little bit a part of that later on. They got really good, but everybody knew that you had to either beat the Steelers or the Raiders, or in many cases both. Buffalo was okay back in those days. They would make it to the playoffs, but they weren't good enough to get to that next level. That came a little bit later. Obviously, in the 90s, they were the team to beat early and often in that decade. But great rivalries, great games. The Steelers lose the Immaculate. Well, they win the game again in the Immaculate Reception year of 72. They lose to the Dolphins, as I said. The following year, they lose to the Oakland Raiders in 73. In 74, let's just take a look at some of the draft picks that they had. All these guys are rookies. You've got Jack Lambert, John Stallworth, Lynn Swann, Mike Webster, Donnie Shell. Those five pieces were absolutely significant for the Steelers. And in 74, they win the whole thing. There's a picture against the Minnesota Vikings. They beat the Vikings. Then they beat the Cowboys 2 times. They beat the Rams 4 times in 6 years. They become NFL and Super Bowl champions. Franco is an amazing part of that. He rushes for 1,000 yards his rookie year. His 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th year, he has over 1,000, not 1,400, but about 1,200, 11. He's 1,000 yards. He and Rocky Bleier end up becoming household names. They go to the Super Bowl. As I mentioned, they win it every time that they're in it. And Pittsburgh has now become the cream of the crop in terms of NFL talent. Give a real quick perspective on what you think about, in those days, in that era, but the consistency, their ability to beat the NFC almost at will. Close games, but they always would overpower somebody. Fantastic defense, and obviously Franco being a key piece to the running game for them.
Well, there was a nastiness to that team. The Steelers always have kind of been that team where it's a nasty, we'll beat you in the trenches, we're going to overpower you, we're tougher, we're stronger, we're more physical. And that's kind of been the embodiment of the city now, if you look at over the last 50, 60, 70 years. And the football team really has sort of put that in the forefront because of how they operate. And they say, hey, yeah, this represents us very, very well. But I mean, Franco was a huge part of it. He had 8 separate seasons where he rushed for over 1,000 yards in his career, which I don't care which area you play in. As a running back, that's spectacular. He had 5 years where he had double-digit plus touchdowns. I mean, and you knew he was going to get the football because, hey, they want to run. That's their bread and butter. I mean, you have a guy by the name of Terry Bradshaw who's pretty good as well. But they knew that, hey, at any point, if you can run the ball really well, it makes it easier on your quarterback. You can control the tempo, control the pace, and especially the guy like Franco Harris. He's a big guy. He's very, very hard to miss. So, hey, number 32, circle it, whatever you need to do on game day. This guy needs to be stopped, and they still couldn't do it. His numbers are spectacular. I mean, he's still 15th all-time in rush yards, which I know obviously he was, I think, second when he retired. But, I mean, if you look at 15 to 11 and 10, it's a couple hundred yards. So I mean, he's still, as far as where he is in just his stature as far as all time for the NFL. I mean, Franco was, all time phenomenal.
Part of what he did was not spectacular. But if you take out the average plays, which there are plenty of them, it's 3rd and 5, and he gains 6. He doesn't gain 56, he gains 6. And one of the critiques of Franco Harris was, he runs out of bounds too quickly. He didn't want to take that extra hit, and he's not that tough. Okay, be the hater and say that. But Franco was always out on the field the next play.
Yeah.
Again, not spectacular. There are great throws that you see of Bradshaw hitting Stallworth or Swan or Benny Cunningham, but they were very rare when you think about it. And, they'd only throw for 185 yards, and their opponent might throw for 204, but they win. That's the thing about the Steelers, and their defense was so stinking good, right? Not just the steel curtain and the amazing front four and all that, but they could cover, and they could get to the outside and stop your running game. Lambert, yes, amazing in the middle. But so was Jack Ham. That dude's a stud now. And Andy Russell, who is probably, if you stood next to him in a subway, you'd go, there's no way you're an NFL linebacker. Fast as lightning. He could get to the outside and turn everything back to the inside. Where Dwight White, where L.C. Greenwood, where Mean Joe Green, those guys ended up cleaning up for him. Death by paper cuts, in many people's opinion, because they did, this guy was good, this guy was good, this guy was good. You put them all together, and they were great. They were better than you just slightly on game day, but not, ESPN highlight reels. That's not their style of football. It was a long, slow death. If you played them in Pittsburgh and you knew it was going to be a 60-minute game that took 3.5 hours to play, that was amazing. But anyway, so the folklore with the Steelers begins in 72. In 74, they win their first. And again, I mentioned that the 4 Super Bowls that they had, 74, 75, 78, the 79 season. And then most of those guys started getting a little bit older, long in tooth. Franco, incidentally, had a contract dispute, and that's why he ended up going to Seattle in 1984. He was looking for a little extra money. He's approaching Jim Brown's record. He was only a couple hundred yards away, but he ends up playing his last year in Seattle. But that became an issue with the Steelers. They didn't want to spend a whole lot of money. You could play there, you could win there, but if you were going to want to make a lot of money, you'd have to go somewhere else. And I think that's one of the drawbacks of the Rooney family. I'm not criticizing their success, folks. I'm not doing that. But the Rooney family and their budgeting was completely different than most of the other teams, where Washington and Oakland would spend money. Al Davis would say, yeah, come on over, finish your career here. Well, not you, Franco, but everybody else. But it was a very interesting perspective from a business side. They would fill that stadium every week, but they were only charging, $25 a ticket? So they weren't making additional revenue, and they just kept the boat sailing the way that it did. But in 84, he ends up ending his career with the Steelers. I mentioned the Seattle Seahawks. Only played in 8 games. He started 6, 170 yards total. So a kind of a questionable way to end his career. Obviously not in a Steeler jersey, and so close to breaking Jim Brown's record. He was just 190 yards away from breaking Jim Brown's as being the leading rusher all time.
Yeah, I feel like that's the reason for, the money obviously is always going to be, it's a test of time, right? It doesn't really matter what era, but I feel like that was the enticing factor for him to go to Seattle and say, hey, I could be the all-time leading rusher in the NFL when it's all said and done. I don't think he's too upset with being second when he walked away, and I don't think he's too upset with where he is now. I think it all worked out. But yeah, the Seattle days, probably one even he maybe tries to forget. Like, hey, we don't really talk about that. We don't need to bring that up. And I certainly Steelers fans will agree with that sentiment.
Well, the Steeler faithful, obviously loyal to him in so many different ways. And one of the great tragedies is that Franco dies just 2 days before he's set to be honored as in the Ring of Honor. His number was due to be retired, but he wasn't able to make that ceremony for obvious reasons. And he died in his sleep. He was living in Swankley, Pennsylvania, and that was on December 20th, 2022. So just a couple of years ago, he was 72 years old when he passed. And, that was such an emotional time for Steeler fans because you were going to bring the band back together one last time. And when Bradshaw left, he left under extenuating circumstances. It wasn't an easy release, but to get all those guys back to honor Franco, which I think every last one of them would say he deserved it and he earned it. And it was long overdue. And that's the thing about, ceremonies like that or Hall of Fame inductions. Ken Stabler had passed away, and then the writers look around at each other and go, why on earth didn't we put him in? He didn't get to enjoy it while he was alive. So unfortunately for Franco, he passes when that great honor was to be bestowed upon him. But Brian, 4-time Super Bowl champion, second leading rusher when he retired, third in touchdowns, and his statistics just speak for themselves. Give me your final thoughts about Franco Harris.
He kind of epitomized the position as far as what he was able to do, his style of play. It wasn't 3 yards in a cloud of dust, but it was like you said, hey, you don't need to break a 64-yard run. If I'm getting 6 yards on 3rd and 5 every single time, you can live with that. That's winning football. He was a part of that. The Steelers did nothing but win when Franco was there. They had a tremendous amount of success. I don't know their winning percentage, but 4-time Super Bowl champs is pretty good. And I think any fan base would take that in any era under any player. What he was able to do as far as the league standpoint, not just the Steelers standpoint, he's still a name that everybody knows. The Immaculate Reception. And like you said, the 72 Dolphins were undefeated. They're the only undefeated team ever. And when you talk about 72, you talk about the play. It's the Immaculate Reception first and foremost. We don't really talk a lot. There's not a ton of Dolphins highlights. It's Franco making that play. It's one of the more unbelievable plays in NFL history. It's just the controversy behind it, as well as if you talk to a Raiders fan versus you talk to a Steelers fan, like you said, you're getting two completely different answers based on who was on the field, based on who they're cheering for, and Franco being synonymous with that play forever, because we still talk about it regularly. If you look at they'll do their playoff, the NFL do their little playoff highlight reels, like, hey, history of the league, whatever. You see the Immaculate Reception every single time, whether it's CBS, whether it's Fox, it doesn't really matter. And Franco being the face of that is pretty cool, and he'll live on in the history of the league forever because of it.
Yeah, some of the names that we mentioned earlier when you talk about just on the offensive side, Bradshaw or Swan or Stallworth or Frenchie Fuqua, names that every Steeler fan knows. But the guy that actually did it, not was on the field or not was on the sideline, not was on the defense, the guy who did it and started what I would call, in all respect, a little cult of their own, where the Steelers had been nothing in the NFL previously. You mentioned that only one time had they even gone to the playoffs prior to that. And go from nothing to where in less than a decade, they ended up with 4 Super Bowl rings. And to have Franco be that guy, it changed everything. Yes, America's team was the Dallas Cowboys, but if you didn't like America's team, the dark guys on the other side with the black jerseys were either the Raiders or the Steelers, and that's who your team was going to be. And it was amazing how that worked out for him. All right, Pittsburgh Steelers, Seattle Seahawks in the NFL, a Penn State Nittany Lion, Rancocas Valley regional high school star. Here's just a couple of the highlights that go with Franco Harris. I'm going to read them verbatim. 4-time Super Bowl champion, Super Bowl MVP in Super Bowl IX. That was him. He was the Offensive Rookie of the Year in 1972. He was the NFL Man of the Year in 1976. He was a first-team All-Pro in 77, a second-team All-Pro in 72 and 75. He went to the Pro Bowl 9 separate times in his 13-year career. He was the NFL rushing leader in 76. He's a member of the all-time Steelers team, and that will never change. You cannot have a Steelers honor team without putting Franco Harris on it. He's in the Hall of Honor that they have. His number 32 was retired. We mentioned that just a few moments ago, 2022. He was a second-team All-Big East in 69 and 71 in college, second leading rusher in NFL history, and he is a member of the Pro Football Hall of Fame. He is one Franco Doc Harris, and we want to take a moment or two just to honor him. And everyone will have an opinion on the Steelers or Franco in particular, and whether it's good, bad, or ugly, it's got to be filled with great Steeler highlights and 4 Super Bowl champions. So for Brian LeBel, we want to thank Vincent Turner, who'll be back with us next week. I want to thank Jeremiah Long for producing and being our engineer today. We want to thank you for being a part of 100 Yards of Football. This has been our Legend Show. Thank you for tuning in, everybody. Have a fantastic rest of your day.